Postdoc in School of Philosophy.
It's videoing us.
It is, yes.
Where's the actual presentation?
Yeah, I was just thinking it should pop up here, but...
Cool.
And our first talk this morning is from Darren Durant, and the title is Might the Honest Broker Model for Scientists Be a Backward Step?
Okay, thank you. I'm hoping that we solved the feedback problem on this thing. Okay, so what I'm going to talk today is about this honest broker model. And I think a discussion about the honest broker model that comes from Roger Pielke, which is suggested as a way of figuring what to do with experts in contentious controversies. We can think about this particular honest broker model as one way of answering some of the questions that we see here in the workshop. When should we and when should we not trust experts? Should or could experts strive to make value-free judgments in scientific topics? And are experts subject to special epistemic or moral obligations in virtue of their role as experts? So start with a few general remarks. In other words, I won't spend too much time on these. But a few general remarks is that we're all quite aware that expertise is an ambivalent kind of thing in democratic decision making. We know, for instance, just from a broader sociological angle, I'm not sure we could do a count. I think I've only counted Reiner and I as the only kind of people who would self-identify as sociologists of science. You can put your hand up if you're another one. So we're kind of like the outliers and you're a bunch of crazy philosophers. But us sociologists were well aware of the idea that we know that the very kinds of mechanisms that generate expert knowledge, the autonomous mechanisms of professional communities, are also the very same mechanisms that give rise to the dangers of discretionary power. So we know of these things, so something about the ambivalence of expertise is not new. And we also know that having a problem with expertise, especially as experts exercise discretionary power in political decision making, we know that this is part of a much broader trend, for instance, mapped in political theory, sometimes called the cultural shift, a movement away, as this chapter is called, from elite directed to elite directing politics. So we know that our problems with expertise are part of a much broader cultural shift that's been going on for quite some time. So Pielke's honest broker model is one option for dealing with experts under these particular conditions of ambivalence and a cultural shift. What I want to talk about today is that I'm going to suggest that this honest broker model is actually the very worst way that you could go. So as a model of freedom, it contains all of the worst options that you find in models of freedom, and therefore is inadequate because of that, and therefore we have to go back to the drawing board a little bit when we're thinking about what to do with experts. Right? In other words, we actually don't want them to be honest brokers. So that's slightly heretical, but we'll put it in the strongest form. We actually don't want them to be honest brokers. Right? So we know, for instance, when we're looking at the idea of honest brokers, Pielke says that it's okay for experts, or it's possible for experts to play a number of different kinds of roles depending on particular conditions. So depending on, is the decision context characterized by both values consensus and low uncertainty, and so you get various kinds of options along the way: science arbiter, pure scientist, issue advocate, honest broker. Pielke's initial discussion of this kind of ideas takes out from the analogy of restaurant selection, for instance. So you have some guest over at your home, that guest says, I'd like to go for dinner, and then Pielke cashes out the different things that the science arbiter, the pure scientist, the issue advocate, and the honest broker might say. So I figure that most people are aware of this, so I'll kind of move on a little bit from there, and we'll focus just on the honest broker role. So the honest broker role, says Pielke, arises because we have a situation where both values consensus and low, there's no values consensus and there's low certainty, or there's high uncertainty. So the honest broker role falls out of this, and let's say that we want to defend this particular notion. So we don't want to be too negative about it. Let's say that we want to defend this particular notion and say, where are some of the intuitions coming from that suggest that we might want experts to play this role of the honest broker? So one place that supports the intuition is if we take the analogy here with the post-normal science diagram from Funtowitz and Ravitz, for instance, then one of the interesting advantages of the honest broker role is that it does address one of the key weaknesses of Funtowitz and Ravitz's post-normal science suggestions. So as Wesselink and Hoppe have argued, one of the key weaknesses of the post-normal science suggestion is that even though it embraces the idea of external peer review communities getting involved in making decisions about controversial matters that involve technical material, one of the weaknesses of it is that it seems to not be political enough. And their argument is that it might not be political enough because for them, what Funtowitz and Ravitz do is they take something that in these particular little figures in their particular article, which they get from somewhere else, I believe, they say, okay, so what's going on in the post-normal science scheme is that we've got an idea of moderately structured problems, and you're trying to move the problem out of being a moderately structured problem into something like a relatively well-structured problem. And so you end up with a kind of inadequate politics, they say, because for Funtowitz and Ravitz, most of the problems that they call post-normal science problems, they want to put up here in this type right box here, moderately structured problems where the issue is about the goals, for instance, and Westerlick and Hopp say, well, actually a lot of the problems called post-normal science problems are actually unstructured problems. They should be over here. And this comes with different kinds of politics, as you see over here, for instance, agonistic politics, etc., versus normal science procedures. So one thing about the honest broker model is that it does address this particular criticism that when you're dealing with experts and getting them involved in controversial matters, you want to have a conception that's political enough to match the particular circumstances. So this might be one advantage of the honest broker model because it explicitly embraces the idea of a values and political discussion. Right? So it addresses that particular criticism. Another way that there might be an advantage to the idea of the honest broker role is that it encapsulates a lot of the sentiments that you see in Dan Sarowitz's notion of an excess of objectivity. So Sarowitz, for quite some time, this is an article, this came out in 2000. I think the idea there might have been a precursor idea to it a couple of years before this, but the idea comes out in 2000. I'll flick just forward a second. There's a 2016 update. This article, Saving Science, comes out in The Atlantic, a neoconservative mouthpiece, but we'll get to that. So Sarowitz's notion of an excess of objectivity says that, as his quote, science is sufficiently rich, diverse and balkanized to provide comfort and support for a range of subjective political positions on complex issues such as climate change. So it's kind of like taking the Duhem-Quine hypothesis and marrying it to political contestation and saying as soon as you get some kind of science trying to involve itself in policy making, you've got no linear path. Instead, it's a very fragmented, fractured path where different stakeholders or pre-existing stakeholders in a particular debate will be able to find some piece of science that warrants their particular position. They'll go hunting for it, they'll go cherry picking for it, and they'll find some piece of science that supports their position. Is the excess of objectivity notion descriptively accurate? Sure, we can probably all think of hundreds of cases that match this kind of descriptive pattern. Right? I won't talk about it too much here, but I probably have a normative critique of this excess of objectivity notion. In other words, what does Sarowitz end up saying that you want to do? What's the roles that are left for science? And so the second role here is it helps guide action after political consensus is attained. Most people might actually buy into that particular idea. Sarowitz also says that it alerts us to problems. My worry is that if the excess of objectivity argument of Sarowitz's is actually true and he doesn't give any scoping conditions for it, then how is it actually that science will actually alert us to a particular problem if any stakeholder can make anything they want of any piece of science? How does science actually alert us to something? You would think that science alerts us to something because regardless of your stakeholder position, science can say, you're a bit wrong here. I don't know, I think Sarowitz might undercut his own argument there on the alert thing. So, in a critical vein, even though the honest broker model matches that kind of sentiment, it captures the idea that if we're in an excess of objectivity situation, we may want our scientists to be acting as some kind of broker to kind of steer us through these complexities. The problem is that, and you kind of see it come out in the later rendition of the excess of objectivity argument, it seems to me that it tries to paint science into an ever smaller corner of social space. So I do worry that the excess of objectivity argument actually ends up saying that experts are pretty useless to us and we really shouldn't do much with them at all. So that takes us towards a criticism of the honest broker model. Now this diagram here is obviously kind of crazy, and I use it here, and you can take this particular little description here or this chart here and kind of cash out the various positions. I only want to focus on just the one under attention today, the honest broker one. So all these little descriptions here are going through Pielke and saying, what is he saying about each one of these particular roles and how they function and what the assumptions are that are embedded in them and so forth. Ignore all that, the details are there, you can ask me later if you really want to. Let's just focus on the honest broker alternative. So for Pielke, what the honest broker is doing is that the honest broker is both engaged with decision alternatives, so that's good, But the honest broker enables the freedom of choice of others. The honest broker expands the scope of choice of others. So the role of the expert in the honest broker role is simply to expand the scope of choice of others. Now the question is, when you're thinking about the role of the expert, ideally in this particular scheme, is to expand the scope of choice of others, well, what might be some of the problems with thinking through that the role of the expert is to expand the scope of choice of others? At the most abstract kind of level, the largest abstract conceptual kind of level, there's an argument to be made here that thinking of the role of an expert as just expanding the scope of choice of others actually recapitulates a problem that we see in neoconservative approaches to the idea of expert authority. Now, for neoconservatives, there's a distinct trade-off between democracy and authority. But for neoconservatives, what they're worried about is that it's democracy harming authority. So democracy is a kind of undermining force in authority relations, and without authority relations, you won't have a smoothly functioning social order. So that's the neoconservative approach. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the mechanism at work there is the assumption that democracy and authority trade off against each other. I would say that Pielke's honest broker model, when it says that their true role of experts is to just expand the scope of choice of others, participates in that very same logic of assuming there's a trade-off between experts and democracy, or assuming there's a trade-off between authority relations and democracy. Only in Pielke's case, he just inverts the error of trouble. So for neoconservatives, democracy undermines authority relations, whereas for Pielke, authority relations undermine democracy. So that's why you need your expert to just provide democracy with as many choices as humanly possible. If it does anything more than that, it undermines democracy. So you get the interesting thing here that an argument ostensibly from the kind of left of the political spectrum ends up joining with the right of the political spectrum, each assuming the same kind of problematic trade-off relation between authority relations and democracy. This is probably why, for instance, if you've been watching the STS news lately, the Science and Technology Studies news, there was an article by Sergio Sismondo in Social Studies of Science where he talks about, is STS really responsible for this crazy right-wing populist politics anymore? And he's like, no, that's not us. And Steve Fuller's reply is like, no, it's us. So probably the reason why you get those kinds of responses is because there's an underlying intuition there that there's a little bit of a joining of assuming this trade-off relation, right? So at the largest abstract level, I would say that there's a problem with the honest broker role because it participates in that same kind of trade-off relation, which actually puts us in the same camp as neoconservatives. Which, if you want to be in the camp of neoconservatives, that's good. But if you don't, it's bad. A more abstract level, thinking of this through an idealization scope, is drawing on the work of Mark Warren, the political theorist Mark Warren, who's written a lot about how essentially what Warren says is democracy sucks. Democracy is tough. It's really burdensome. The demands on citizens are really high. The ability of citizens to get involved in politics without kind of getting depressed about the whole thing is low. So Mark Warren writes of democracy as an awesome thing that's tough on citizens. So he's one of the few political theorists talking about deliberative democracy that explicitly recognises that when you want to talk about deliberative democracy, you have to take into account that it's very tough on citizens to actually engage in those kinds of efforts. It's burdensome and it's psychologically troublesome in a lot of capacities. So the interesting thing about Mark Warren's argument applied to this is that if we think about this little conceptual scheme that Warren comes up with, what he's trying to figure out is, we know that down on this particular side here, that if we think about the deliberative resources of citizens, they're going to be unevenly spread. And the capacity of citizens to get involved in deliberative democracy is going to be affected by the time they want to give, how much knowledge they feel they possess. It's going to be determined by the level of attentiveness they want to give to any particular issue. It's going to be determined by the level of security they feel when they get involved in contentious disputes, for instance. How much does it trouble them to get involved in contentious disputes? So along all these kinds of dimensions, Warren says what's actually going to happen is that for the average citizen, they're going to choose some issues that they're really passionate about and they're going to give their time to and they're going to be very attentive to it. And that's going to mean there's going to be a whole bunch of other issues that they don't give their time to and they're not attentive to them. So the actual state of ordinary citizens in a democracy is going to be that sometimes they're high, sometimes they're low, depending on the particular issues. Now, the interesting thing about this particular scheme is that what Warren is basically saying is, what's the ideal movement of issues in a democracy. The ideal movement of issues in a democracy is actually between box 1 and box 4. So the ideal movement in a democracy is that basically if you're an ordinary citizen, sometimes you'll go, I'm really concerned about vaccinations and I couldn't give a fig about nuclear power. So I'm going to devote a lot of my attention to figuring out some kind of engagement with the vaccination issue and none of it to nuclear power. And what that means for the ordinary citizen is that on vaccinations, they're up here, and on nuclear power, they might be down here. So that's going to be the ordinary movement of citizens in a democracy in an ideal kind of state. They're going to be engaged about something that they're concerned about. And then for other kinds of things, they're going to be happy with certain forms of deference, for instance. And it's not going to be autonomy challenging as long as you have a kind of collectivist epistemology notion rather than the kind of the individualist epistemology notion. The individualist epistemology notion is always kind of this assumption that as soon as you defer, you've lost your autonomy. Well, that argument really only works if your epistemology itself assumes that the individual knower is the paradigm case of the knower, whereas for sociologists, paradigm case of the knower is the collective. So Warren kind of participates in those assumptions as well and thinks that's going to be your natural motions in a democracy. Now, Pielke's notion doesn't make that as an idealization. Pielke's notion basically does this. It says, what we're really worried about is this. We're really worried about deference. Deference robs us of autonomy. So we've got to keep issues up here. We've got to constantly subtract issues from here, move them from there, back up to here. Of course, at that particular point, does an issue ever move down here? I don't know. So Pielke's issue, or Pielke's honest broker model, is running, I would say, into a few idealization problems. What we should want is some kind of movements between here. Pielke's notion sticks us going back and forth between there, like a lot of SDS, like a lot of my own field of science and technology studies, making this kind of presumption that that's the ideal movement. No, that's the ideal movement. But that's another abstract argument. You can ask about it as well. Let's get a little bit more detailed. In SDS, we often talk about we want scientists to be reflexive. What does it mean for scientists to be reflexive? Well, if you go to Brian Wynne and some of his other cronies, and we look at the Demos pamphlet, for instance. So Demos was one of these little think tanks that got involved in the whole third way thinking, which you're a leftist. It was a sellout of leftism. It's another story. But nevertheless, if you go to the Demos pamphlet and you see, well, what is it that they actually recommend that scientists would do if scientists were being reflexive? Well, what they would apparently do if they were being reflexive is they would engage in reflection and dialogue and social and ethical political issues, and on the wider social visions and values driving science and innovation. They should become a normal and integral part of the scientific process. Reflection and engagement on wider social dimensions must not be externally imposed. It must be embraced by the scientists themselves, right? You can't just force it on them. They must take up the task for themselves. They must like doing so. Scientists must reflect on the social and ethical dimensions of their work. And so they talk in this pamphlet about building more reflective capacity into the practice of science, bringing out the public within the scientist. Okay, so if that's what counts as reflexivity, and the honest broker model says that the scientist kind of restricts themselves, withdraws from these debates, and just becomes an information provider, an information conveyor. It's like recapitulating the worst aspects of the deficit model of science communication at that moment. So this is actually not a kind of model that would encourage a scientist to be reflexive. So even on normal SDS grounds, this model has a few problems with it. Let's say what might be the general background account that lets us understand this honest broker model, right, as some kind of idealized state in a society. I think it goes back to Isaiah Berlin. And that has both a good and a bad element to it. So Isaiah Berlin talked about what he called negative liberty, and he contrasted that with positive liberty, right? So this quote down below, a later quote from a posthumous work of Berlin's, the essence of the notion of liberty in both the positive and the negative sense is the holding off of something or someone, of others who trespass on my field or assert their authority over me, or of obsessions, fears, neuroses, irrational forces, intruders and despots of one kind or another. Right? If you read the work of Brian Wynn's just got a much more convoluted way of saying the same kind of sentiment, that we worry about experts because experts rob publics of the ability to enunciate their own autonomous meanings, for instance. So it's a similar kind of sentiments and negative liberty concession. When Berlin cashed out the idea of negative liberty, he contrasted it with positive liberty. And the two conceptions were answering different kinds of questions. So the negative liberty conception over here what is the area within which the subject is or should be left to do or be what he is able to do or be, without interference by other persons. And so negative liberty was about freedom from interference. And in Berlin's analysis, you give the caveat that you have Mill's principle, the harm principle. It's justified to exercise power to avoid harm to others. So aside from that particular caveat, to be free was to avoid being interfered with by others. And positive liberty answered a different kind of question. Positive liberty answered this question of what or who is the source of control or interference that can determine someone to do or be this rather than that. So if you follow this particular definition of liberty, the positive conception of liberty, most of us who are wondering what can experts do in democratic decision making by contributing some kind of guidance without robbing people of pure autonomy, actually what we're doing is we're treading in the positive liberty terrain. We're actually we're theorising expertise in a positive liberty vein. And of course, negative liberty is the dominant liberal theory of freedom, and positive liberty is often said that you can easily run straight to totalitarianism, for instance, and that was Berlin's concern, that as soon as you get into positive liberty, it involves the state telling people what's good for them. Right? So it's autonomy violating very quickly, thought Berlin. So if we go back to our honest broker model, right, is it a negative liberty conception? Berlin, freedom is not the absence of obstacles to the fulfillment of a man's desires, but the absence of obstacles to possible choices and activities. The extent of a man's negative freedom is, as it were, a function of what doors and how many are open to him, upon what prospects they are open and how open they are. So the role of the honest broker, I would say, gets its intuitive legs. The reason why we're attracted to it is because it matches those negative liberty sentiments that are dominant within our political cultures. That to be free is to open doors, and that you are not free if someone is closing those doors on you in some way. Someone is interfering with you in some particular capacity. Right? So let's say that's a good part. Right? To the extent that negative liberty encapsulates a whole bunch of things that we value in democratic or in liberal democratic societies, this tells us why the notion of the honest broker has intuitive appeal to us. But there are problems with it. Let's say the honest broker model rests on account of freedom as non-interference. So let's say we grant that one just for the moment. If we go to Berlin and we see what it was that he was actually arguing about. So you go to Berlin and he starts off his discussion by saying Thomas Hobbes was an idiot. And the rest, then he has a few paragraphs saying this is why Thomas Hobbes was wrong about freedom. So Hobbes' account of freedom as non-interference. So for Hobbes, a free man is he that in those things which by his strength and wit he is able to do, is not hindered to do what he has a will to do. You are frustrated when the option you prefer is obstructed, not if an option you do not prefer is obstructed. So you're free when you've escaped all external hindrance. So this is Berlin's discussion of Hobbes' account of freedom as non-interference. And then what Berlin says is that this is obviously wrong. The problem with Hobbes' account, says Berlin, is that freedom should not come by challenging restrictive constraints, not by adapting to them. I need only contract or extinguish my wishes and I am made free, Berlin says of Hobbes' account. If to be free negatively is simply not to be prevented by other persons from doing whatever one wishes, then one of the ways of attaining such freedom is by extinguishing one's wishes, Berlin says of Hobbes' account. To teach a man that if he cannot get what he wants, he must learn to want only what he can get, may contribute to his happiness or his security, but it will not increase his civil or political freedom, said Berlin of Hobbes' account. So Berlin is an anti-Hobbesian intuition. Adapting your preferences so as to choose things that are accessible cannot make you free. The honest broker model inherits that problem. So if you go to the climate fix, Pielke says, well, the iron law of climate policy, what this means is that climate policies must be made compatible with economic growth as a precondition for economic success. Global values restructuring its pipe dream, says Pielke. Reducing economic growth or limiting development is simply not an option. Now, he may be right about all those particular things from a pragmatic point of view, but it's also adaptive preference formation. So the honest broker model, I would say, inherits the problem in Hobbes' account of freedom that Berlin was at pains to point out. It gets worse. So let's say we go to Philip Petit and his Republican account. So Petit wants to look at Berlin's account of freedom and say, I don't think freedom as non-interference works either. Petit says, Berlin was right. Hobbes's account of non-interference, Hobbes's account of freedom as non-frustration, it doesn't work because it just leads to adaptive preference formation. And Petit says, but there's a problem with Berlin's account as well. So Berlin's account has a problem, freedom as non-interference has a problem as well. Petit says, Berlin supposes if you know a power can interfere but won't if you ingratiate yourself, you are free. You are free if you experience no interference in two options. And then Petit says, you are not free in cases where I have the power to interfere and to do so in one of the options, but apparently for Berlin, you are free if I have the power to interfere but do not in either case. But Petit says, this is a problem, this can't be the case. Now it seems you can make yourself free by ingratiating yourself to me and getting me to let you have your way. You cannot be free just by cozying up to the powerful, says Petit. Pielke. This is after Trump. Scientists apparently should face up to the difficult question of what they should be doing for Trump. Scientists might position themselves as representatives of the public good rather than just another special interest group, which is kind of like slipping in the account that scientists are just a special interest group. Scientists would make peace with big oil. I don't know, do you have to make peace with big oil? Scientists who choose not to engage with the Trump administration risk fueling the resentment and disenchantment that brought it to power. So it's all your fault, in other words, if you're a scientist. I don't know, this to me looks like ingratiation. So the honest broker model has inherited the two problems with the two main theories of freedom that we've seen. It's inherited the adaptive preference formation from Hobbes's account of freedom as non-frustration, and it's inherited the ingratiation problem that we see in Berlin's account of freedom as non-interference. So you're kind of still in jail. This was from I was invited to give this talk at a bioscience conference where they wanted me to talk about scientific advocacy, and it was just after Trump, so I called the talk, How to Make Science Great Again. Half the audience got the joke and the other half went, what's he talking about? I was like, I don't know, read the paper. Right? Anyway, so I think that the account that underlies the honest broker model inherits all the problems of accounts of freedom that we're aware of. So let's go to Philip Petit again, for instance. Does he offer us a way out of this kind of problem? Petit says neither adaptation nor ingratiation counts as a possible means of liberation, and any theory that entails that it can serve a liberating role has to be inadequate. In other words, I'm suggesting there's no way that being an honest broker is really going to help scientists in the end. To the extent that I have a power of interfering without cost in your choice, I count as dominating you. Free reign is not enough for free choice. So why do I pursue the Petit line here? Well, because maybe part of the idea that we're attracted to this model of the honest broker from Pielke is maybe we're actually not taking the problem of power relations seriously enough. Like the kind of power that we actually want to avoid is actually not adequately addressed by Pielke's notion of the honest broker anyway. So it's right that we should want experts to not be part of discretionary power relations that can dramatically impinge on people's or citizens' autonomy, for instance. That's fundamentally right. But have we set the bar high enough? Maybe the honest broker model sets the bar a little bit too low. So Petit's account of the kind of power relations we want to avoid may be the right standard. So for Petit, the kinds of power relations that we want to avoid is arbitrary power. And of course, his Republican conception, which is not from the American Republican Democrat, but from the old kind of classical Platonic conception, etc. So, back to the Greek time. So it's an older conception of republicanism. He probably shouldn't use the word republicanism, but that's another matter. So arbitrary power, says Petit, allows us to distinguish acceptable from unacceptable interferences. Right? So we should be concerned about interferences, but some of them should be thought of as acceptable and others as unacceptable, in other words, says Petit. So examples that he gives that give us windows into what counts as arbitrary power are the situations of slaves, the situations of people in domestic abuse, situations of people under tyrannic bureaucratic rule, for instance. So these are the kind of models for thinking through ideas of arbitrary power. And part of Petit's account is to say that arbitrary power is not discretionary power, which is my way of saying that the honest broker role really targets essentially discretionary power, but the kind of power that we're often concerned about is actually arbitrary power, not just discretionary power. There are lots of cases in which discretionary power is fine. But we should be concerned about arbitrary power. right? And Pilke's notion doesn't necessarily do much with that. In other words, how is it actually going to help in a situation of arbitrary power that you leave the choices up to everybody else who are already under situations of arbitrary power or being manipulated by arbitrary powers? It's really not going to help them that much. So Petit says that there's a procedural dimension and a substantive dimension to arbitrary power. I'll kind of skip over this just so I can get to some other points, for instance, but you can come back to it if you want to cash out this idea, because these slides for Petit are really just a way of saying that we want to avoid arbitrary power, and Petit gives a whole account of how we avoid arbitrary power. But my main point by bringing in this part of Petit is just to say that discretionary power is probably not the kind of power that we should be targeting when we're worrying about experts. It's arbitrary power that we should be targeting when we're worrying about experts, and the honest broker model doesn't really target arbitrary power, it only targets discretionary power. So I'll just conclude by saying there's probably an account that you could give that avoids all the problems of the honest broker role, for instance, and that has a way of thinking about the relationship between democracy and authority that doesn't presuppose that they have a trade-off relation between them, for instance, some kind of inverse relation. You could go through those particular books. They'd be a good kind of starting point. I'm just saying there is an account that you can drag out of there, for instance. Harry and Reiner might think that they're making strange bedfellows here, but there's an argument to say that these accounts are compatible. So don't be an honest broker. That's all. That's the end. Thank you.
So we now have time for questions. Raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. Yes?
Okay, I'm sort of groping here, but the thing I'm not straight about is I'm trying to think about your account as an account of the relationship between scientists and society, and I can't work out what we've got to say about the extent to which scientists' rights or powers here should extend to science or should extend beyond science into political policies. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I think, I guess part of what I'm suggesting is that, at the first step, for instance, I'm suggesting that if it's not good for scientists, it's probably not going to end up being good for citizens. In other words, if we want scientists to be the kind of resource, that it's going to be good for citizens, we probably don't want to give scientists a self-restrictive, probably self-contradictory role, for instance. So trying to box them into this particular role is not necessarily going to put them in the kind of position we want to be, because probably what we want is we want to have some kind of guidance relation that avoids arbitrary power. And at that moment, the honest broker role is not helping the scientist, and therefore it's not helping the citizen. So that's what I'm suggesting there, that there's a relationship there. A backstory account to that, and this comes out in the little slides, which are kind of here as teasers, I guess. The slide with Mark Warren's discussion of neoconservatism, for instance, and the idea that the honest broker model really just is the same kind, treading the same kind of terrain, right, just in an inverse way. I would say that there's a case to be made that, historically speaking, scientists have often helped citizens and helped policy making by showing particular problems with scientific products, for instance, identifying causal relations and causal chains, environmental contaminants and so forth. And at that moment, what we've actually got from scientists is guidance relations. We haven't got straight information provision. So there's a backstory argument there that when we think of a bunch of cases where science has actually helped, it actually hasn't been by scientists being honest brokers. Right? They've been more like the Rachel Carson stereotypes than the honest broker. Right? I'm not sure who was.
Okay, just a very short question. It's not clear to me the difference between adaptive preferences and the standard learning from experience processes. Because one could say that the adaptive preferences are just the outcome
Right.
of a learning process. In this case, for instance, we learned that we can't have two hands at the same time, or means are too expensive. In this case, they have little to do with negative freedom.
Well, it's a bigger debate there, so it goes back to, basically what I would say to this is that your argument is actually with Berlin, right? So I'm going to say Berlin was able to differentiate between adaptive preference formation and straight learning, and so the argument is really, I'd have to turn it over and say, well, You're really arguing with Berlin. But I think there is a conceptual difference there. And part of the conceptual difference in Berlin's discussion is to say that adaptive preference formation is always done with a view to the kinds of politics that you can get away with, the kinds of political choices you can get away with. So it looks like it's opening up, you know, your political choices, but in the end, it takes the available political choices and aligns with a particular set of them. So this is part of how Berlin draws a conceptual distinction with it, right? But I would say that if Berlin's wrong, I'm wrong, so, you know, in that one.
Yeah, I mean, I share a lot of the criticism about the honest broker model, but I think you were characterizing Tilke's position a bit unfairly, because the 4 types he lists, he says scientists have a choice, and he thinks all 4 roles are to be played by scientists. What you didn't mention, I think the whole book is an attack on what he calls stealth advocacy.
Yeah.
Experts or scientists saying, look, I'm only telling you the facts. This is the objective knowledge we have about it, but they have an agenda which they don't tell you about. So this is why he wants to expand scope, because he says often the scientist who poses as science arbiter is in fact the stealth advocate, and you should avoid these situations. So they should be explicit about what is possible to do and provide all the options so people can check. And that's, I think, is the context. You put him into a context of, you know, debates about liberal theory, which he really doesn't cover very much in the book. He's about, you know, how policy preference is framed, and he goes back to Schneider saying, the person who defines a problem has the power, right? So that's the framework from which he operates, and I think so it's slightly unfair to put him into a context where you think he would look very weak because he hasn't addressed these issues. But I mean, the point about authority and democracy, to say that this is also a neoconservative framing, I don't know. I mean, I think there is a trade-off between the two, and it doesn't depend on which political side you are. People seem to see there is a trade-off, there is a tension, and you need to solve it somehow. To say there is a tension doesn't make you a neoconservative. I mean, Habermas and others have talked about that tension decades ago.
Well, a brief reply, just to the last one, for instance, I wasn't actually saying that because you assume a trade-off relation that makes you a neoconservative. I was saying that if you assume the trade-off relation, don't be surprised when you end up in the same political camp with the neoconservatives. So that's why I suggested that.
I don't see that.
Well, we can talk about that later. But that's why that's why I mentioned the Sismondo and Fuller places. This is why they're getting into this kind of discussion about why is it all of a sudden that, you know, science and technology studies is getting kind of used and abused by the political right populists and so forth. I'm like, well, but that's a longer story. We'll get to that. The direct answer to your question about, so you're right, for instance, that I was being slightly unfair by focusing on just the honest broker role and what's implied by it. So I would say there's lots to defend Pilkey's account of the other 3. Right? So I'm not denying that. Part of my focus is to say the honest broker gets held up as the ideal state, but I don't think it's the ideal state. The other part I would say, just very briefly, is that when I think that just like Sarowitz, when Pilkey actually comes to defend the other roles that the scientists will take, I think that, and it's a bigger story, so I can't really go into it here, but a bigger story is that I would say it ultimately makes science a toothless tiger. So I doubt the seriousness in some ways, but that's a bigger story, obviously.
Yeah, I want to follow up with the sense that that you may not be treating the honest broker role totally fairly. And let me say, though, that it needs this kind of attention, because although Pilkey himself consistently disavows its idealness, the scientific community at large latches onto that and ignores the whole rest of the chart. I mean, but Pilkey himself defends issue advocacy, and I think that I think that in Climate Fix, he's openly functioning as an advocate, and he's said that. So I think it's a little unfair to put that forward as an example of honest brokering. So honest brokering, one of the problems is I've never worked with a broker in normal life. It's not an analogy or metaphor that has the same concreteness as advocates, because we know we're surrounded by advocates. But I don't think it's just providing more diverse information. The most compelling example that he gives in the book is the CFC case, where you have advocates locked pro and con, and an honest broker comes in about, should we limit them or should we keep them going? And the honest broker comes in and says, hey, look, there's this other chemical we could use. Industry, you could make a profit. Advocates, environmental advocates, it's not as bad for the ozone layer. And that's the new option. So it's actually, I would say that's a form of positive freedom.
Right, yeah.
It doesn't just expand our range of choice, it actually creates, the advocates are locked into this narrow-minded debate, and the scientist provides a way of achieving political agreement, not a weapon to beat the other side, but a new option that both can converge on. That's really the only example he gives of honest brokering, but that one is kind of compelling, and it doesn't quite fit with your account.
Yeah, and some of that criticism is true. And the genesis of the talk is back home in Australia. I was invited to 3 separate conferences: a bioscience one, a kind of discussion panel on Australia's having a discussion about whether we should go nuclear, basically, as a way to address climate change, and a climate change conference. And in all 3 cases, I was asked to talk about this idea of scientists getting involved in policy making, for instance. And all of them had a completely idealized account of the honest broker. Right? All of them interpreted it as straight choice enabling of others. Like, no. So part of it here is to push it to its extreme and say, well, we take it as the idealized case. It's actually not ideal. And then we can work back from there. So challenge it at the ideal case and then work back from there to see what's remaining.
I actually like the way that your paper sets up a possible alternative, which is, if scientists love honest broker, let's step in and make a better explanation. Let's just use the word and substitute some content, particularly focused on, I like the idea of discretionary responsibilities, because I think it fits really well with what I was saying yesterday about responsibility. What are the responsibilities? What are you accountable for?
Yeah.
How can we think through those options?
Yeah. I'm not sure if we have more time, but
we have another minute if anyone wants to ask a question. If no one does, we should thank our speaker.
okay, thank you.
Speaker in this session is Shane Ryan. The title of the talk is The Epistemic Environment and Expertise.
Thank you. Okay, so in this talk I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to articulate what I mean by the epistemic environment and what I call epistemic environmentalism, and then I'm going to look at a proposal. So really this is actually, it's a little bit different from a lot of the other talks so far. It's essentially work in applied epistemology. So the first part about the epistemic environment is a way of conceptualizing the world around us from an epistemic point of view. And it's intended to facilitate applications, interventions in the environment so as to improve epistemic attainment. So basically to improve people's chances of getting more knowledge or more justified belief or more understanding. And then the second part is directly related to expertise. It's looking at a particular application with regard to how we can do better when trying to judge expert testimony. So how the layperson can do better when it comes to judging expert testimony. And the background to that part of the discussion is work done by Hardwick and also by Goldman about the difficulty of the non-expert making judgments about expert claims. Okay, so I've basically said that. Okay, so let me let me say a few relatively brief things about epistemic environmentalism, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail. So central features of our epistemic environment that influence the acquisition of epistemic goods are the interconnections and interdependencies that exist between different epistemic agents and their physical environment. So actually the idea is that when it comes to the epistemic environment, it's analogous to the way we think of the conventional or geo environment, that there are these different interconnections between different agents within the environment, but also between the physical environment and agents, and they will have a big role to play in how well people do epistemically. And just as the physical environment may be polluted, and so these interconnections and interdependencies may be disrupted, so too can the epistemic environment be polluted, and epistemic interconnections and interdependencies may be undermined. So as I'll say, this is very influenced by work in social epistemology, and so for particular examples, we can think of different epistemic environments, say where there's one environment with a free press, for example, and another environment where there's no free press. The distribution of speech or maybe claims about politics is very tightly regulated. And so depending on what's happening in the environment, of course, this can have epistemic consequences for the agents within that environment. So the environmentalism component of epistemic environmentalism also mirrors the form of non-epistemic conventional environmentalism. So basically the idea is that just as one can be, of course, concerned with the environment and wants to, say, protect the conventional environment, someone can also be concerned with our epistemic environment. They can be, say, concerned with the apparent rise of fake news, and they can maybe want some kind of intervention to try to protect the epistemic environment. So they're concerned with the attainment of epistemic goods, and they see features or facts about the epistemic environment, and they think, well, those could be different, and our epistemic environment could be better. So there are facts about the environment, and some of those facts may be regarded as positive or negative. Such facts may motivate the epistemic environmentalist to action. Epistemic environmentalism, as a framework, sets out conceptual apparatus for articulating what's positive and what's negative about the epistemic environment. So epistemic environmentalism is basically drawing on two areas of discussion within epistemology. It's not reducible to these two areas, but it's drawing quite heavily on these two areas. So one is on social epistemology, and the other is on epistemic value theory. So first, with regard to social epistemology, and this is fairly closely related to how Alvin Goldman talks about social epistemology. Takes social epistemology roughly to be the study of the influence of other agents, social institutions, and social arrangements on the epistemic standings of agents. It examines ways to alter or create such influences on the epistemic standings of agents. And that's very much what I'm going to be focusing on when I talk about the particular application. So as I said, the application is concerned with helping us do better with regard to judging expert testimony. But it's also a feature of epistemic environmentalism, that we're not just concerned about the interaction between different agents within the epistemic environment, but we can also be concerned with the interaction, or at least the kind of relationship between an agent and some aspect of maybe the physical environment, or say maybe choice architecture that needn't be a kind of relationship between two agents. Epistemic value theory examines the worth of epistemic standings. Findings from epistemic value theory may be used as a basis for judging the felicity or otherwise of epistemic environments. So basically, epistemic value theory is very important in providing a motivation for caring about the epistemic environment being one way or another way. So it's because plausibly, say, knowledge or justified beliefs or understanding are valuable, that we have good grounds not to want the epistemic environment to be such that it's very difficult, say, for us to gain knowledge, and for us to want it to be such that knowledge is more easily attained. So this in turn can be used to provide a justificatory basis for making changes to those epistemic environments. Okay, so this is sort of just a kind of reiteration of what I've said. You can start with this: if knowledge is valuable, and if because of certain features in the epistemic environment, less knowledge is possessed than in alternative epistemic environments, then ceteris paribus, that epistemic environment is worse than those alternative epistemic environments. It doesn't have to be knowledge. You don't have to be tied to focusing on knowledge. You could have other standings. You could talk about justified belief. You could talk about true beliefs that are of interest to us. You could talk about understanding. You might want to talk about wisdom. So there are other possibilities. But the idea here just is that, look, if a epistemic good or different sorts of epistemic goods are valuable, then that gives us a motivation for caring about what way an epistemic environment is, and it can provide a basis, a kind of justificatory basis for interventions in that environment. So here's the epistemic environmentalist principle. If a valuable epistemic good can be attained or its possession preserved by making an intervention in an epistemic environment, then ceteris paribus, such an intervention should be made. So obviously the ceteris paribus part here is important. So of course there might be some things that we could do to better the epistemic environment that we wouldn't want to do because, say, they might involve unwanted infringements on freedom of speech, for example, right? So, of course, this is not an all things considered principle. It's just saying that, look, if you have two different epistemic environments and one is better epistemically, well, then we have reason to favor the better one. We have reason to want to have the better epistemic environment. Okay, so that's a kind of background to epistemic environmentalism in terms of what it means. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of interventions that you could have as an epistemic environmentalist. One thing that's important for me to point out is that just as with conventional environmentalism, you could have lots of different sorts of epistemic environmentalists. Some might want to go further than others. Others might be a bit more, they might not like certain means that you could follow in order to bring about epistemic improvements. So there are lots of possible variations within epistemic environmentalism. You could basically have a kind of epistemic paternalist, or you might not, right? So there's lots of different possibilities. Okay, so here are some of the different ways you might have epistemic interventions. So adoption of epistemic environmentalism may involve attempts to protect the epistemic environment, mitigate harm done to the epistemic environment, or enhance the epistemic environment. So obviously the first one is essentially a very conservative approach. You're just trying to stop harms from happening to the epistemic environment. The second one is accepting maybe certain things that are harming the environment, but trying to counter them in some way. And then the third one is looking at ways that we can change the epistemic environment so as we can improve our epistemic attainment. So just on the first one, attempts to protect the epistemic environment, by that I mean measures taken with the aim of preventing harms to the epistemic environment from being done. The second one, attempts made to mitigate harm to the epistemic environment. I have in mind measures taken that aim to lessen or nullify harm done to the epistemic environment. So an example here would just be, say, a fact checker, right? So you might not want to stop certain groups from making false claims, but you might want to counter the epistemic harm done by having a fact checker on those claims. And then the third one, attempts to enhance the epistemic environment. I mean measures taken to engineer the epistemic environment so as to improve it. So that needn't be looking at something new that's happening that's harming the epistemic environment. It might be, say, looking at how cognition works and trying to figure out how choices can be presented in a better way so that people are more likely to do well epistemically when they encounter those choices. So the epistemic environment is a shared space. Various interests are bound up with its condition. There are a number of actors that have a role to play in its maintenance and enhancement. At a kind of lower level, citizens and institutions such as universities and corporations have a role to play in rewarding good epistemic behavior and sanctioning bad epistemic behavior and taking responsibility for their own epistemic behavior. It's to be expected, however, that the extent to which these parties fulfill this role will vary, and in general their actions will be restricted to a local level. So just as with the environment conventionally conceived, the epistemic environment stands to do better, plausibly, and be looked after systematically if the state also plays a role. So epistemic environmentalists, just like geoenvironmentalists, can of course disagree on the means by which the environment is looked after. So when I talk about the state having a role, a lot of people get a bit nervous, and of course they think of some kind of paternalism or maybe a kind of big brother type scenario. So just as I said, I'll just reiterate what I said, that you could be an epistemic environmentalist without thinking that the state should play a role. But to me at least, it seems plausible that just as the state can play a role with the conventional environment, there is a good case for the state to play at least some role with regard to the epistemic environment. And of course, when it comes to making decisions about how far you should go to improve the epistemic environment, then of course you have to take into account other things as well as epistemic considerations, like are we losing other goods if we go so far to try to improve our attainment of epistemic goods. So those things have to be considered. But I think it's very defensible that in principle the state does have a role in looking after the epistemic environment. And then what I should also say is the way that this can work. So I talked in a previous slide about other actors being involved. So this can work, of course, by rewarding good epistemic behavior. And it can also work by informal sanctions. So in an epistemic community, bad testifiers, as Goldberg talks about, can be, say, criticized or rebuked, and this can play a role in improving that epistemic environment. And then you might, again, might be something that you balk at, and it's not something that you have to buy for the application part that I'm going to talk about. But you might also think that the state has some role to play in having a kind of a formal sanction in certain situations to damage when the epistemic environment is damaged in some way. Okay, so this is the proposal. So this doesn't involve a state intervention to improve the epistemic environment. So many of our beliefs about the world around us, including ourselves and those we care about, come from the testimony of other agents. Other agents play a significant role in determining the quality of our epistemic environment. They do so not only by testifying, but also by monitoring, policing testimony of others. So even with monitoring and policing, the quality of individual testifiers may vary greatly. So a testimonial recipient is often ill-equipped to make a judgment as to the reliability of an individual testifier. This is especially so when the recipient has had no previous experience with the testifier. Now, there are some things that can help. So, for example, if the testifier, say, has recognized credentials, of course, that can make some contribution. Okay, so this is really where the proposal comes in. And the background just is that Hardwick in the 80s, and he wrote it again about it in the 90s, has a discussion about our dependence on the expert. And the idea is that in an area that requires expertise, the non-expert can't gain knowledge except by believing the expert. Just because, by definition, if it's an area that requires expertise and a non-expert doesn't have expertise in that area, then they're depending on the expert for knowledge. Now, he's not saying that you have to always believe the expert. That's not the position. So he imagines cases where it could be rational for some layperson to not believe an expert, say on the basis of knowing that they're receiving funding from the tobacco company or whatever else. So it can be possible not to believe the expert. But of course, when you don't believe the expert, it's not that you're gaining knowledge in the area that requires expertise. And so it looks like we have this kind of blind dependence on experts, according to Hardwick, for knowledge. So Goldman has a paper that comes a bit later that looks at what we can do when trying to decide what expert to believe. And he talks about different possibilities. One of the possibilities, the most kind of promising possibility, is looking at the track record of an expert testifier. And so the idea is supposed to be that this is a way that means that we're not completely blindly dependent on the expert. There's something that we can do. So in theory, this looks like a good idea to some extent, right? So you have an expert testifier, and if in their testimony they make claims of a predictive nature or claims that can be checked, then you can, in theory, see what their track record is. You can see how often they're getting things right and how often they're getting things wrong. Practically, though, this looks very difficult. So it looks like it would require a lot of time and even a lot of very kind of demanding cognitive work of the non-expert if they were really to look at the track record of each expert testifier that they want to kind of decide whether to believe or not. So it looks kind of impractical, basically, as a way of improving the non-expert's position vis-a-vis the expert. So public discourse in recent times has been characterized by controversy surrounding expert claims on economics and the likely effects of Brexit, election polls, and man-made global warming. On the one hand, population groups have been criticized for not giving proper credence to expert claims. So this is something that Axel Gelford speaks about. And then on the other hand, however, trust in experts has been undermined by experts famously getting some things wrong. The reliability of experts as a class is likely to differ depending on the domain, the different domains of expertise. So I think that's something that's important to emphasize if you're inclined to be a defender of expertise, that we shouldn't expect the same level of reliability when it comes to, say, economics as we might expect in other areas like, I don't know, maybe chemistry. Ideally, a layperson's credences will be fine-grained such that they are responsive to the individual track record of particular expert testifiers. Given the limited resources of a lay testimonial recipient, however, it's not surprising that this doesn't happen. Okay, so the proposal, and this part is very much a work in progress, and so I'm kind of giving you a kind of suggestion, and I hope you can give me some feedback on maybe areas that I need to tighten up with regard to this proposal. But the idea is that you could have a Wikipedia style app, a kind of wiki predict for expert predictions, and this could contribute to improving the situation. So the problems that that Goldman talks about in terms of the non-expert judging expert testimony seem very real, right? So we saw how it is just very difficult for the non-expert to try to track down what the experts' claims have been, how good their track record is, and so on. But this isn't necessarily a problem, right? So this is something that actually we can improve. We can improve the situation of the non-expert trying to identify the track record of the expert. So the idea is, as with Wikipedia, users would create pages, but on these pages you'd have events or trends, ones that may occur, ones that have failed to occur as predicted by experts or claimed, and ones that have actually occurred. So such pages could include things like the Millennium Bug, not sure how many people remember that, the 2003 Iraq War, the Great Recession of 2008, the collapse of the euro that was often predicted, Brexit and the 2016 US presidential elections, the Trump presidency, and so on. So you could have lots of these pages, and on these pages you could have the predictions that were made with regard to these issues. And aside from such pages, there could also be pages with the names of individual experts and content regarding that expert's predictions. Such pages stand to benefit the epistemic environment by providing the public some evidence as to the trustworthiness of experts. So the position of the non-expert testimonial recipient vis-a-vis the expert testifier would be altered so as to strengthen the epistemic position of the non-expert. And non-experts would be in a position to achieve greater epistemic attainment with regard to expert claims. Thank you.
So that's a really interesting proposal, the idea of the wiki. I also wouldn't be as negative as yourself about the possibility of non-experts evaluating experts. But the point I wanted to make was just a small one, and that was about the hesitation you showed in Mhm.
all children in the establishment of the university. So, you know, I would replace that hesitancy with just some actual statements about how the state has a fundamental effect on our student environment.
Okay, great. Well, I'm happy with that response because really the way I've talked about this has been in response to other people who are concerned that this proposal is kind of greenlighting some kind of Big Brother situation. And so I mean I obviously don't think that's right, but I'm trying to kind of be responsive to that kind of concern.
Yeah, so, but did you mention the media? I mean, that's the usual point where people get nervous, right?
Yeah.
So, if there are voices in the media that are distorting the facts, whatever that means,
Yeah.
And there could be contentious debates about what the real facts are, right? So where will be the legitimation for intervention to say we need to have a better epistemic environment, so therefore we need to regulate the media in some way or other, or introduce censorship?
Yeah. Okay. So, and this is where it gets trickier, right? So this proposal for this talk isn't, I think, tricky in the sense. Yeah. So this is something I've worked on. The epistemic environmentalism stuff is something I've worked on quite a bit. So it's something I did in my PhD thesis. I'm coming back to a bit now. And another proposal is precisely with regard to certain types of bad testimony, certain kinds of dishonest testimony. And the idea is that testimony that is knowingly not known, not simply mistaken, but knowingly not known, but presented as known, is the kind of testimony, or this is what I argue, is the kind of testimony that should be regulated. And it's not simply, it shouldn't simply be from very significant players in the epistemic environment. It shouldn't just be from the media, who are a significant player in the epistemic environment, but it should also relate to expert testimony and individuals in a position of epistemic authority, like politicians as well, when they're talking about something that they have privileged information about. And the idea is that that kind of testimony should be regulated. And the idea, also, one part of the idea is that at the moment there are informal sanctions in place to deal with a lot of these problems, but I argue that those informal sanctions don't go far enough, and it would be appropriate to have a unified response. So you could have something like a kind of basically a kind of a list of epistemic polluters, and if you make this kind of claim, you're found to have made this kind of claim, you could go on a kind of list of epistemic polluters. You might want to argue that you should go further, but of course, then you're really getting to the situation of a trade-off between freedom of speech and protecting the epistemic environment.
Doesn't the term polluter mean there is a known state of natural purity? Who is to say what it is? So, I mean, I guess people rightly get nervous that those people who would make the regulations to make these definitions would have the power.
Well, the regulations themselves I don't think should be the problem, but it's just when, so you might worry at the point that someone is making the judgment whether something is true or not, you might worry then. Well, look, I think legal systems already have to deal with that kind of situation. They have to decide if someone has committed perjury, they have to decide in some cases whether someone has performed hate speech. So I don't think I would be introducing a kind of new problem. It would just be an extension of something that's already there.
So it would be dealt with by the legal system?
My proposal is that, so this is kind of a different proposal, but that proposal is arguing for a kind of tribunal for a media organization or say, a politician who engages in this kind of bad testimony that I've described. And if they're found to have kind of broken the rule, then they'd be on a list of epistemic polluters. It's kind of like a shaming approach. And that could have other consequences as well.
Thank you. So my question isn't really against the proposal. It's more, so I take it that part of the dialectic is to say Hardwig is like blind trust, Alvin's view is just too onerous, right? I mean, it's not really practical. And I guess in your proposal maybe is to kind of sort of be in between there. And I guess one way I think there's just a more nuanced interpretation of Alvin's view that is maybe in keeping with the proposal, maybe it's more in line with the proposal. But I mean, this whole idea of like looking at the track record of experts, I mean, I think just as a matter of fact, we do that all the time. Just not in I think one thing that might be helpful for your proposal is to just have a more nuanced approach to certain kinds of domains. So you chose some examples that I think make the case for for it being too onerous a little bit more plausible. But when I think about my own kind of discrimination among experts, I discriminate extensively by doing research, right? So one thing that I'm particularly interested in is like humane products, right? I mean, I care about like kind of not animal testing. I'm a vegetarian. I try to eat vegan as much as possible. So I'm very concerned about these sorts of issues. So I did a ton of initial research at the very beginning to look at the Humane Society or PETA or Mercy for Animals, and I found the organization that I thought actually had the best practices. And then they have websites that outsource all of my epistemic work for me, right? I mean, I can outsource it. So they'll tell kind of have lists of all of the products that are vegan, all of what kind of animal testing they do. It's become extremely easy now. I just go to their website and I kind of outsource a huge amount of my epistemic work. Think about when you're looking for a doctor. You go online. We used to have to rely on travel agents as experts. Now we just go to TripAdvisor, and it's hundreds and hundreds of reviews are aggregated for us. So I actually think that we do a ton of. There's many ways in which it's actually really incredibly easy to discriminate among a great many kinds of relevant issues for ourselves in the way that Alvin was proposing. I don't think this is really at odds with your proposal. It's just to say, I think that it's maybe as a false dichotomy between Hardwig and Alvin.
Yeah, so I think in the example that you gave, that's an example where you can find expert testimony and you can have confidence in the expert testimony, and that looks fine. I suppose when you're interested in checking the testimony, then there's kind of there's a kind of presumption of, maybe this isn't right if you're concerned to check in the first place, and then what are you to do? So it makes sense. What Goldman proposes is looking at the track record of the expert testifier, and what I'm saying is that here's a way to try to make that easier. Now maybe that's just one kind of relationship you can have with expert testimony, where you're in some kind of doubt or you have some reason to want to check. And what I'm proposing is a way to make that easier. Because I think while Goldman's proposal is impractical as things stand, it's not necessarily impractical. So I think there are things we can do to try to improve our situation with regard to tracking.
So I'll just say one quick follow-up. I just don't think it is impractical as it stands. I think you need a more nuanced assessment, right? So I think that it's maybe impractical in certain domains and not at all impractical in other domains.
Okay.
I mean, I think that as a matter of fact, we do check the track records of our experts in a lot of domains with tremendous ease because of the internet.
Okay.
So just to return to the state in a second, there's another rule that state plays insofar as it's also a monopoly over large domains of information.
Yeah.
And it also privilege certain forms of inquiry over others. So it's not an unbiased actor. You really have my intuition is that you really have to factor in the state as an active role or as a player within that game, as opposed to the argument.
Right. Yeah. I think there are ways that you can deal with those kind of concerns. So, of course, in lots of other areas, the state isn't a neutral actor, or at least there are some concerns about the neutrality of the state. And the way we try to address some of those concerns is by having an independent judiciary that, you know, can find a politician or can find against the state in certain circumstances. So I would just appeal to that. I would say yes. When it comes to action in the epistemic environment, we might be concerned about the neutrality of the state, but we don't have to be reliant on the state being the kind of the judge of what is illegitimate action or not.
Yeah, I have a concern. You're talking about expert testimony, and then when you talk about this kind of website, you throw in this thing about prediction.
Right, yeah.
And I personally think that the conflation of expert testimony, expert opinion with prediction is a huge problem, and I think it's one of the reasons why, if experts are in low regard at the moment, I think this is the reason. I think if we look, like yesterday we had the example of Michael Gove and what he said.
Yeah.
If we think of economists as people who make economic predictions, they're rubbish, right? So that leads us to think that economists know nothing and they're rubbish.
Yeah.
Economists are quite good at explaining what happens, they're not very good at explaining what's going to happen. And I think that that's true of most fields. I think the people who are good at predictions are very, very few and far between, and they're living on islands because they've made a lot of money on bookmakers. And in the normal world, people are not predicting the future successfully.
Well,
in any kind of way that's difficult to predict. Right?
Okay.
Well, scientists can say the ball's going to fall to the ground.
Yeah.
That's not what we mean. So having a website that says this guy predicted that there would be no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and this guy said there would be. For me, I don't see that that's of much value to anybody.
Okay, so if you're right and experts are rubbish at making predictions, and you have a site that shows that this is the case, then surely that's of use, right? Because then presumably people will learn that, okay, experts are good at some things, but maybe we should have less confidence when it comes to their predictions about, say, what's going to happen economically in 2 years or 3 years. So I'm not saying I agree that experts are rubbish at making predictions, but if that is the case, then I think it would be useful for public discourse if you have easily available evidence to people to show that this is the case. But it may not be the case, right? So it may be the case that some experts are in fact better at making predictions about what's likely to happen to the economy, or what's likely to be the consequence of, say, a Brexit vote, or whether Trump might win the election or not. And if that's right, some people are better at making those predictions, then they'll get some credit for getting that right. And if they have extensive enough track record, then it seems appropriate that people give their claims a bit more credence than someone's claims who's getting things consistently wrong.
I was with something like guessing that Trump is going to win or Clinton's going to win. I would say that's a guess, and if someone guesses right 5 times, I would still say that that's just guessing.
Yeah, well, so you might then want an extensive enough track record where it seems just very implausible that this person's just guessing.
But for lots of people guessing, then you the law of large numbers coming in. Someone's going to be right over multiple iterations.
Yeah. Yeah, so you wouldn't just look at the times that someone is right, you'd look at the times that they're wrong as well.
But if you have millions of people who are making...
We do have a few people who want to ask questions, but I can't put you on the end if it's hard.
I just want to make the point that this afternoon, at last presentation before the last one, we're exactly on this topic, and there is data, and some people are better than others, and there are track records, and there's a substantial literature on this, and we'll show it to you.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, my worry is very much along the same lines, Martin, but just to have a different view on that. There's many dimensions of science, so you have predictive sciences and non-predictive sciences, and you also have many dimensions for evaluating expertise. I guess what I'd be worried about this proposal is that it should make all of these dimensions clear. So I'm not in principle against the idea that there is some use to prediction in science and there is some use to having a track record of experts, although we do have track records through many other means. But I'm worried about the flattening on a unidimensional space.
Yeah, so
that you can evaluate expertise on.
Right. Yeah, that would be a terrible mistake.
So that, I think that should be made more clear in your.
Yeah. So the proposal is, so what I've talked about are these cases where predictions have been made or there has been an appeal to experts within a public discourse. And so really the proposal is to try to help with that situation. But I don't want to say, you're right, of course, I don't want to say that the value of an expert is just reducible to how good they are at making predictions. Yeah, I'm not sure how I could. I mean, the proposal is just, it's an application, right? So, maybe there's a way of building that into the application. I'm not sure, but the focus in the application is on how to deal with the situation where experts are making claims, in particular when we're concerned with making choices or making judgments about what's happening in a public discourse.
I really appreciated the paper's emphasis on the infrastructure that ordinary people need to make good decisions.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering whether your proposal to fight pollution is going to lead to epistemic drought or desertification.
Yeah. Okay.
Because if you do impose more sanctions than currently exist, either state sanctions or public, shaming, risk-averse testifiers are going to tend not to say things that they might have otherwise said.
Yeah.
And therefore it's going to reduce the amount of potential information, questionable but potentially useful information out there. This has actually happened in the U.S. Because of the new emphasis on rating hospital quality by outcomes.
Okay.
And so there's some evidence that hospitals are cherry picking the most within a class of case like kidney cancer, they're selecting the most curable ones and then sending the other ones to some hospital that's less risk averse, and therefore inflating their reliability ratings, but at the cost of public health.
Yeah, okay.
And that could same happen with epistemic drought as well.
Okay, so this actually relates to the discussion you had yesterday. So on the one hand, if there are more disincentives to testifying, then of course it seems less likely that someone will testify. But then on the other hand, it seems that there are rewards to getting things right. So if you are willing to testify and you're getting things right, then that's good for you, and you're held in higher esteem. So there are benefits and negatives to testifying either way. With regard to the example with the hospital, so I think the analogy in this case would be something like the experts being very conservative in what they say. I'm not sure that there'd be the same kind of risk, but anyway, there'd be more. You'd expect maybe more conservatism in what testifiers say. But then, as I said, there are benefits to being the one who makes the claim, who gets it right. So I don't think it would mean that everyone just stops saying controversial things.
At least it's something you should include in your analysis, though. There's pros and cons when you alter the environment.
Yeah. I mean, there are already incentives and disincentives to testify. So it's true. What I'm suggesting would increase the level of disincentive, but I'm not convinced that it would do it by so much that you would get a drought.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. There's no coffee downstairs.
Yes.
Right?
In this building on this location.
We will restart at 10:30 with 10 speakers.